Everyone can hear? Excellent. Thanks to my opponent for coming and debating and all the call-out judges. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. By refusing to pull out of the disastrous nuclear deal with Iran, the American people do just that. Sit on their hands while the world becomes a dangerous place. Here's a couple brief definitions. The nuclear deal is referring to the 109-page agreement between the United States, Iran, and a few other countries. And the phrase pull out means to get rid of the Iran deal or pull it out of its current state. Here's 4 reasons why the deal is disastrous. First, the Iranian government is evil. According to the State Department, Iran is the leading state sponsor of terrorism. They support Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Assad regime in Syria. In fact, the Iranian regime has executed more people than any country except China, including more than 6,000 Iranians for being homosexual and 1,000 American soldiers in Iraq. The Iranian regime repeatedly calls for the extermination of Israel. No other country in the world is committed to annihilating another country. In fact, the supreme leader of Iran says, quote, "It is the mission of the Islamic Republic of Iran to erase Israel from the map of." The second point is $150 billion. With the Iran deal, the United States handed over $150 billion to the Iranian mullahs who lead their regime. This enables the further funding of greater terrorist expansionism and also removes the weapon embargo that enables greater militarization. Number 3 is that the Iran deal enables the Iranian nuclear weapons program. You see, the Iran deal sets a 10-year deadline on Iran's uranium restrictions, after which they can launch greater amounts of uranium production. And then they can have the full capacity to develop nuclear weapons. And that's if they even abide by the agreement, because there is zero accountability. See, the deal provides really no effective safeguards for monitoring Iran's nuclear development compliance. Under the deal, Iran gets to inspect its own military sites. That's right, they get to inspect themselves, and they get 3 months or more to hide any nuclear activity if they object to an inspection by the UN. And even if they're caught, the deal provides no guarantee that the international community does anything about it. The Iran deal even guarantees that the United States will teach the Iranian government to help protect their nuclear program. So the fourth point is that there are better solutions. There are better solutions that enable greater sanctions on the Iranian government, real accountability to prevent nuclear proliferation, and a hard stance against Iran's participation in global terrorism. Very few people have a chance to do something about the greatest evil of their time. By pulling out of the agreement, the American people have that chance.
Alrighty, hey, how you going? Look, I guess I'd probably hate the deal as well if that was what it was, but I just don't know what deal you've read. I'll post the deal afterwards so you can read it and get updated on your facts. But first things first, the first argument is that Iran is evil. Well, I just don't know what this means. Like, so what if they're evil? If you've engineered a good deal with them where you reduce evil's capacity to develop nuclear weapons, then that seems like a good thing. Just calling a country evil doesn't mean that you never make deals with them. For example, the US makes deals with North Korea all of the time to stop them from aggressing on South Korea. Yes, it is a proverbial deal with the devil. And if you, in principle, want to let the world burn just so that you never shake hands with ones who you believe are soaked in blood, well, then that's on you. But you have to actually stand by the consequences, which would have been, had this deal not been signed, a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, one, which I don't think any of us wants to happen. 2, you said that we handed over $150 billion. Okay, so just to clarify, we didn't hand them money of ours. This is money of theirs, which we had frozen and stole from them. So we just actually freed up money, which already rightfully in a free market economy would have belonged to them anyway. Secondly, your claim to why this is actually harmful is actually that it will enable them to further terrorist expansion. I'd like to point out that this deal has occurred over 2 years ago, and I would be very curious to hear what sort of terrorist expansion has happened, because as far as I've been seeing over just geopolitically, Iran has actually funded many of the fighting against ISIS because they're from a different Islamic sect, and so if anything, the money has been going to wind down terrorism in the region. The third thing you've talked about is that after 10 years, we can't do anything. Again, this is just factually untrue. I'll post the deal. But look, we get to the International Atomic Energy Agency gets to do oversight in perpetuity of the sites which we already know about. We get to do ones which we don't know about with an appeal process for 15 years. We have the Joint Commission Authority for 20 years. I'll post all this afterwards, but I just don't know where that you've got this 10 years figure from, because it's untrue. Likely with the monitoring and accountability is also untrue. The International Atomic Energy Agency has been given unprecedented monitoring authority, unlike any other country in the world is subjected to. We get to, from the sites which we know there are centrifuges in, monitor them in perpetuity without appeal and no waiting period. Iran is not monitoring themselves. That is simply just a lie. There is an appeal process, yes, but that is an appeal process which is not for 3 months. It is 24 days, and it is where Iran has to appeal to a board, to a judicial authority, of which we have stacked the authority because it is the P5, so it's like the EU5 plus 3 more, and we are the majority in that authority. So we get to inspect anywhere we want, including their military sites, which potentially have nothing to do with nuclear energy within 24 days notice. After 15 years, yes, that appeal process goes away and we won't get to inspect anymore, but we've still got 15 years of no arms, which is probably a good thing. So I'll pass it back to you.
Let's talk about some of the main flaws in your argument. You said essentially that we can make deals with evil countries if we reduce their capacity to be evil. First response, it doesn't reduce their capacity to be evil. Even if we take your numbers, which say about 15 and 20 years, we still look at a situation in which Iran has the capability to significantly increase their uranium capability within 15 to 20. Now, the difference there is coming from some of the facilities are about 10 years, some are 15, some are more, depending on the percentage of uranium and how pure it is. That's all the specifics. But regardless of if it's 10 or 20, this is a short-term solution that provides long-term damage. You also talked about North Korea. Let's look how well that turned out. If you turn on the news right now, we see a lot of problems with North Korea's nuclear weapons. They're not a good example on this issue. Secondly, you talked about how there are sanctions. Yes, that's how the $150 billion got handed to them. But let's take a look at the best case scenario. Best case scenario, they don't pursue nuclear weapons for 10, 20-ish years while they become a thriving economy and gain international legitimacy because of this agreement, while they are still the leading sponsor of terrorism. You talked about how it was 2 years ago when this happened, and hey, Iran's not that bad right now. That's simply false. If we look at 2016, we can see that the State Department declared Iran the top sponsor of terrorism. How'd that fare 1 year later? Well, PBS reported on July 19th that they are still the top state sponsor of global terrorism. So this idea that Iran is now doing a great job isn't really supported by the evidence. Now, you're giving me the little shake, which is I think you're saying, do I have evidence that it increased the terrorism? Well, the fact that they're still the top sponsor of terrorism, still supporting Hezbollah, and because of the weapons embargo, still have the ability to front that, shows the evidence for that. Let's talk about the 10-year period. We talked about that a little bit already. The core argument here is that there isn't any accountability that's actually sustainable. You talked about the inspections, and you said there was a 24-day period. That's true for some of the facilities. For other ones, the appeal process takes a lot longer. And experts calculate that even with just 24 days, that's enough time for Iran to remove the evidence of their nuclear program from those areas. All Iran has to do is say, we appeal this, and then remove the evidence. And let's not pretend that Iran has clean hands on this. They have skated their international obligations over and over again. So to pretend that we can put blind trust in the Iranian government is to remain oblivious to the historical ramifications of what Iran has actually done. So you also haven't addressed my response that there are far better solutions that don't involve the current Iran deal. Now, the issue about Iran being evil is actually an important one. You can write that off and say it doesn't matter, but when we prop up and give legitimacy to a government that is perpetrating terrorism across the nation, the only country that wants the full extermination of Israel, then that is something to be concerned about, and that's something to be worried about. Back to you.
All right, so I guess the thing we've got to do with this debate is realize that there is no perfect solution and we have to choose between the two of them. So let's start with the first one you talked about, which was capacity to launch evil. Under your side, where there is no deal or a better solution of yet we had yet to hear a single deal, a single detail, they have all of their enriched uranium. That uranium, which they currently do not have as a result of this deal, they would have all of it. So the deal is good for that reason, that we got rid of the vast majority of their enriched uranium. Secondly, we have dismantled the vast majority of their centrifuges, to which, if there was no deal, would just be built again. We would have zero capacity to inspect them, no waiting period, in which case you expect them, with the credibility of your unnamed experts, can dismantle an entire nuclear research facility in 24 days. Good luck. That we might have, under my side, we get those 24 days where they have to hurriedly move place to place. Under your deal, there is no inspection authority at all because there is no deal. There is also the access of the sites we do know, which don't have no rating period. Under your side, there is no access. Under my side, there is access with absolutely no obligations at all. So really what we're getting at here is that you're pointing to the compromises in the deal, which are actually somewhat reasonable. Like, you can't just inspect our military sites with no notice. You have to at least give us 24 days, which is, again, I think a pretty reasonable concession, because otherwise they'd never sign up to anything. And you're saying that's ground to scuttle the deal completely, under which case you would remove all access totally. So compare all access removed to some access removed, and obviously some is preferable, which is why you should go with the deal. Okay, so the other stuff you talked about, you said, look, Iran's evil, but your argument is, but you said that I said it doesn't reduce their capacity. Okay, so the problem here is that if you're talking about capacity, then the fact that they're evil is irrelevant, right? It's just, we know they're evil. It's just, does this deal increase their capacity to do evil or reduce it? As I would suggest, not having access to the vast majority of your enriched uranium, not being able to enrich any more uranium, having inspectors constantly on your back, even if for some of the sites they can expect there's an appeal process, means that when appeal process where the court is stacked against them and where they have to dismantle the entire site in 24 days, means that their capacity is greatly reduced if we have to deal. And the other solutions we have heard about from you, we just haven't had any details, and I really want to know what they are, because I mean, you're able to outsmart the United States administration, then I would just say that's the tragedy of arrogance. Okay, then what else did you say? Oh, right. When I asked you how have they gotten worse, you said, well, look, before they were the #1 sponsor of state terrorism, and afterwards they are still the #1 sponsor of state terrorism, which shows that this deal has made nothing worse. It is just maintained the status quo minus all of their nuclear capabilities. What I would ask you is, would you rather the state #1 sponsor of terrorism to have nuclear bombs, or would you not? If you don't, deal.
Right. So the question is not nuclear bombs or not nuclear bombs, because even in the best case scenario with how, let's pretend Iran complies with everything, what's the result? 20 years from now, all the restrictions are lifted basically, and they have the ability to produce nuclear weapons. Now, I know you're going to come back and say, no, there's still inspections and still restrictions, but the reality is the number of centrifuges that Iran will have at the end of that period will enable them to develop nuclear weapons. And if you read the 109-page document that I'm sure you're going to submit, the judges will be able to see that. Now, you've talked about a couple things. There's no perfect solution. That's a false dichotomy. Of course, that's true. That doesn't mean we have to go with your solution, though. There are plenty of solutions brought out there, especially by institutions like the Heritage Institution and Cato, that are differing. So you also talked about how under my agreement, we don't get rid of anything. We just keep the status quo while your deal gets rid of uranium. That's not even true. Even right now with the deal in place, they still have 5,000 centrifuges in order to be producing uranium, and that number only increases over time. You said that it's better that we have some inspections rather than no inspections. Two responses. First, not when America backs terrorism, not when we enable $150 billion to flood back into the Iranian government to perpetrate more crime. Secondly, it doesn't even work. Long-term failure. You haven't shown me why in 30 years Iran will not have nuclear weapons with your proposal. So you also talked about how you need to see a solution. How can we outsmart the United States administration? I think you're being just a little bit ignorant of history here, because if you look at Congress, the majority of Congress actually disagreed with the Iran deal. This is the all-seeing eye of the government and the great deal that everybody wanted, and that it needed to be passed and it needed to be implemented, really isn't responsible, because it's ignoring the vast amount of history that suggests that this deal is a bad idea. From a lot of leadership in Congress, to the leaders of Israel, to the leaders of other nations in the Middle East, all of them saying this deal creates in Iran a regional power. It gives them international legitimacy despite being the top sponsor of terrorism. You said that if they were the top and they were still the top, that's remaining the same. First, that's not actually true. If you're the top and you continue to increase terrorism, guess what? You're still going to be at the top. That doesn't mean there was an increase in terrorism. But my second response is that's a morally flawed argument. To say that, oh, it didn't increase at all, therefore our deal was good, means that your deal was also terribly ineffective. And just the reality of giving $150 billion to the Iranian regime means you're going to see more terrorism. Governments like Iran are not using the $150 billion in loose cash in different currencies to build medical hospitals for their citizens. They're using it to support regimes like Hezbollah and enact their declared mission, which is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. You're right in saying that this resolution is about whether the deal enables Iran to enact greater evil. And it absolutely does. It sponsors their terrorism now, and it enables nuclear proliferation in the future. And you haven't shown me how it's going to stop that.
Yeah, okay. So I've just got a few quick questions. The first is that you made these bold claims about how it will increase Iran's international legitimacy, and it will also increase their capacity to do terrorism. But you earlier claimed that Iran is still decried as the #1 sponsor of state terrorism. Given that it has been 2 years since the deal passed, and this is not, I think, something we have to speculate on, this is something we can just see, were you wrong when you said that they are still being decried as the #1 sponsor of state terrorism, or are you wrong when you said that it's increased their legitimacy?
Right. So when we take a look at international legitimacy, the deal grants legitimacy by being an agreement that after the 20-year period, the 10-year period for all of these centrifuges, you now have the capacity to ramp up your production. And it says that the international community is okay with it. That's the aspect in which it increases international legitimacy. It doesn't increase legitimacy if they're the leading state sponsor of terrorism and continue to be, but that just shows the problem when United Nations and the United States remain oblivious to terrorism that's happening in other countries. So if you have a country where we say, you're a terrible, evil country, but we're still going to give you a sense of legitimacy by saying that what you're doing with your nuclear weapons program is okay under these terms and will be fine, unrestricted in 20 years, that's the problem. So this isn't a contradiction, it's a clear declaration of the facts. Also, I have a couple of questions for you. And I've been asking this since the first debate round, which is 20 years from now, what does the Iran deal look like? Are you going to deny that currently they've centrifuges? Are you going to deny that after the restrictions are lifted, they gain access to produce a nuclear weapon? Your entire solution remains extremely short-sighted, and it ignores the realities of history that show that when you give an evil country like Iran the ability to do more harm to more people through monetary support and international legitimacy of their nuclear weapons program, you create havoc on the world stage. This is exactly what we see in other countries where we have North Korea and lots of other countries where we have nuclear battles now because we weren't well prepared in the past. We don't want to create another disaster out of another country by following your plan.
Yeah, well, I guess the question is for you, when you say, what are we going to do in 20 years? Well, the first thing I'll point to is that many of the restrictions continue onwards for the 20 years. Just because you haven't read the paper doesn't mean they don't. Such ones as the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors and UNC oversight persist into way more than 25 years. We still have an Iranian commitment not to reprocess any of their spent fuel after 25 years, which suggests that we are not giving tacit approval for them to keep going. We are in fact saying that they ought not to. We still have several international atomic energy safeguards. We have International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring and access under the terms of additional protocol over 25 years. We have they may not conduct activities which could contribute to the design or development of nuclear explosives. And we also have an NPT in force on Iran banning the pursuit of nuclear weapons. So there are lots of things which continue on to 25 years. And what that would suggest is that we are not giving them legitimacy, are we? Because we are saying explicitly that they can't do it. So I guess the thing to ask them is that because your claim is one where we have had this deal in place for 2 years and you have not been able to point to anything which has happened. So when you say, for example, they are going to spend this money on Hezbollah, what I would ask you is, can you point me to any relevant stats or statistics of terrorist incidents which could not have been funded absent this deal, or maybe have they increased like dramatically in 2 years? Because what I would suggest is that if what you're saying is true, this speculation that this money is going to enable terrorism on a scale that we have never seen before, then that should have already happened because it's been 2 years. The only thing which has happened actually is that Iran has been complying every single period with the terms of the deal. They have gotten rid of all of their enriched uranium. The capacity to do evil has gone down. I'm also just going to introduce a piece of positive material here. Regardless of whether you agree with the deal's original conception, which you clearly don't, what this motion is a stronger burden for you. It's that we should actually pull out of a deal we have already made, which means that what this does, even if it is a small improvement for you, which I don't grant that it is a massive step backwards, it actually delegitimizes the US as an international actor for all future deals, which is far more important. Because what you've got to consider is not just the implications on Iran's position now. You've also got to consider, will the US be able to conduct any other deal into the future? So your better solutions, I would say, which you haven't provided any reason why the government of Iran would approve a deal which was written up by the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute, right? You've got to tell me now, would Iran sign up to these deals after the first deal they made in good faith was scuttled on them despite their complete 100% compliance? And would any other nation, for that matter, comply with any deal which the US ever tries to draw again? Because now they can just say, well, the last time you did a deal with Iran, you came to fair terms, they did 100% compliance and you pulled out anyway. So I would even suggest that above and beyond the measly amount of terrorism of details we yet to hear, which is supposedly increased, you will almost certainly ruin the US's legitimacy.
All right, so you said, will Iran sign up for a new deal? 3 responses. First, there's 2 options. 1, they do, and we have a better deal than yours. Secondly, they don't, and we impose greater sanctions on them, which cripple their economy, which was happening before the Iran deal took into place. Third, it's not really my burden to show and prove a better solution, but just that the current solution is terrible and that we need to pull out. That is the standard for this particular debate round. There happen to be several other solutions that you could propose and follow. Now, you said this hurts America's legitimacy. I'll grant you a small amount, like if you pull out of a deal, it's not a great thing, but there's 2 factors that matter more. The first one is American protection. American protection of its citizens, of its country, of its own hegemony and sense of autonomy is vastly more important than continuing to stay in a deal that the majority of Congress disagreed with, but that we enacted anyways. And secondly, we have a greater obligation to protect innocent lives than to abide by following a terrible government that is resulting in terrorism worldwide. Look, you don't stay with an abusive girlfriend just because you all have the same friends. And in the same way, we shouldn't stick with a terrible deal with Iran just because we've got some friends in other countries. Our priority is to our citizens first. But I still have a couple questions for you, which is what happens after that year period? You said some of these things last for 25 years. First, that's intellectually dishonest because all of the key measures don't last for 25 years. You rambled off a whole bunch of stats, and I'm aware of a lot of these that last for a little bit longer period of time. But the only question that really matters is when is Iran actually able to produce a nuclear weapon again? And that happens before the 25-year period for a couple reasons. One, the inspections are already very terrible and inaccurate, and we can't get what we want done with them. And secondly, it's a flawed system where after those years and the restrictions are released, they have the greater capacity to enable nuclear weapons. So you also talked about how I haven't been able to show an increased harm. 3 responses. First, we actually do see an increase in terrorist attacks from Hezbollah and some of these other organizations. Secondly, we see increased terrorism attacks happening in the Middle East generally. And third, you can also see that sanctions are a penalty. Look, the reason we enact sanctions in the first place is as a penalty against abusive and terrible governments like Iran. If we remove those sanctions and there isn't a change in a decrease of the amount of terrorism that they are responsible for, then we've completely failed. Because the entire purpose of the sanctions in the first place were to curb the human rights atrocities that the Iranian government was bringing up. Now, I know you're going to come back in your next speech and you're going to say a couple things. You're going to talk about more about how, look at all these things in the agreement that keep Iran from getting nukes. But what I want everyone to remember when you say that is, let's even take 25 years. Let's pretend that Iran is not going to not follow the agreement. In 25 years, where are we when those restrictions release? Let me know.
I guess the first thing to point out is that in 25 years, you will be exactly where you want to be now, but worse, because if you pull out of all of the deal, then you also lose all of the restrictions. So the consequence of your policy is to bring forth a consequence which you don't like, right? Let's just be clear here what in 25 years things mean. It actually means I accept that things are good for 25 years, but afterwards, then where will we be? And the logical end step to that is not to prolong the thing you don't want. It's to make it last as good as possible. The second thing is that you just don't know what happens after 25 years. Like you said, you said it lasts for 25 years. No, I said it lasted after 25 years and into perpetuity, which is significantly longer. And when you're saying these inspections are like really bad, like with what qualification do you say this? They're conducted by the International Atomic Energy Agency. So unless you're going to suggest that the Cato Institute has like a better body, which is going to do inspections, which is better, like I'm thrilled to hear that if that's true, because where have we all been going wrong? Okay, the next thing I want to point out is that when you said I don't have to point to a better solution, I just have to point out that that one's bad, is just obviously flatly intellectually dishonest, right? Like, for example, if your parents are mean to you and you're saying, well, I mean, we just need to run away from mum and dad, and I'm like, well, where are you going to go? It's like, I don't need to show where I need to go. They don't give me everything I want, right? Like, no. You have to compare what the world would be like with the deal compared to what would the world be like if we pulled out of the deal. Your inability to articulate any other solution suggests that the world will be worse without the deal. Thus, it is a reason to stay in the deal. The next thing you did, where you said when responding to my stuff about the US credibility. You said, sure, the US loses credibility, consequences of which you clearly can't, I have not, grasped, right? If the US loses credibility to form deals with its international allies and opponents, that means that the ability for the US to reduce any other form of terrorism or any other form of economic mismanagement or any other form of international diplomacy is drastically decreased. So that is a trade-off, which if you've conceded is a big one, possibly much worse than the consequences of staying in the deal. But you also then said the trade-off is about US, safety, but that's a contingent argument. Because if I'm right, then I've increased US safety, right? Because the deal restricts Iran's ability to develop nukes. And so that argument is not an actual trade-off response. It's just that it's a false comparative. It's contingent. You need to prove that this deal increases their capacity. Overall, look, this is what we're still lacking from you. You've made some flat assertions about terrorism increasing generally in the Middle East, but that's just factually untrue. So, for example, look at the capacity of ISIS. They've lost most of their major strongholds. For example, in Mosul, a one known enemy of ISIS is Iran, right? So you haven't actually shown that terrorism has increased, but I have shown the deals reduce that.
Right. So a couple of quick points. You talk a lot about me being factually incorrect about things, but you haven't really brought up a lot of statistics or points of your own. I brought up the State Department, PBS, and a whole bunch of other organizations that say terrorism has increased. But regardless, you ignored my third point, which is that the entire existence of sanctions exist as a penalty on these countries. And if you legitimize them by saying, we're going to pull the sanctions away, give you $150 billion in aid, and then do nothing about it, well, then you've created a greater problem for yourself. Additionally, the actual question of this resolution is to provide a solution. Of course, I'm providing a solution. If I don't, then that's kind of silly. And I brought up a couple of solutions. You need a solution that enables greater economic sanctions on Iran, enables a better enforcement mechanism that actually tests if they're gaining nuclear weapons. If you cannot do those two things, then the purpose of having an Iran deal falls flat on its face, because Iran can get out of any inspection simply by claiming an appeal and hiding the evidence, or by inspecting themselves when the UN doesn't want to investigate. So you either make a better solution, or two, you can't get to a solution, which sometimes happens with evil countries. And then what you do is you impose greater restrictions and you cripple their ability to function as an economy. So those are the key ways that you can make a better solution, just as a short précis. What I'm still lacking from you is any sense of long-term vision, because all you're talking about is the immediate future. Now you said, what's going to happen in 25 years? Who knows? What matters is if they have the capacity to gain nuclear weapons over that.
Okay, first thing, you haven't explained what legitimizing means. In your first part of your speech, you said they're still decried for funding terrorism. That would suggest that they haven't gained legitimacy. Have they been welcomed onto any more economic boards, which they were before? Has their voice in the international community held more political sway? Can you point to a policy where everyone was thinking, I didn't really count Iran's vote for meeting much before we made this deal with them? No, you can't, because none of that has happened. This legitimacy point is just a non-starter, because you can't point to a single actual consequence of the legitimacy. Deal has been going for 2 years. 2 years. So you should have been able to point to something. Next thing, inspections. Look, when you just keep lying about the inspections. You're like, oh man, they inspect themselves. The International Atomic Energy Agency does the inspections. I don't need to quite cite statistics because it's in the deal. It's in the text of the deal. They're the ones who are responsible for doing it. Okay, third thing, you're talking about we can instead just impose sanctions. Well, we know how successful sanctions are about reducing their centrifuges, because before the deal was enacted, the sanctions were already there. And guess what? They already had the centrifuges. They had the uranium. So your sanctions don't do anything, right? Because we've tried them and they failed. Then you said about long-term vision, which I say, one, many of these inspection authorities last into perpetuity, a point you haven't addressed. But secondly, the long-term deal is not any worse than what you're proposing, because if you say, let's have a think about how you've argued this. You say, sure, you have inspections now, but in the long term, you don't have them. My solution is that we should pull out of the deal, in which case we don't get them at all. So compare the consequence of your thing, which is to pull out of the deal where you reduce all capacity for inspections, compared to we wait out the clock 25 years, which, 25 years without a nuke, pretty good, right? Where the inspection capacity is reduced slightly, right? So that's the comparative there. At the end of the day, obviously you will always be able to poke holes in deals, because deals are naturally compromises. That is why they are called deals. The comparative you have to compare this to is not having the deal at all. And what that means is Iran can, without any inspection authority, massively expand its nuclear capacity, it will have legitimacy to do so because the US was the one who pulled out the deal, and the US will be made corrupt and made unable to form any more deals in the future. And those things are much, much worse than just